This video is sponsored by Keeps. More on them later. Well, the aim was to be positive about Metroid, but that didn't last long, did it? Nah, but I think it's important to reflect back on franchises as old as Metroid and see where the missteps are and how to avoid retreading them in the future. And if there's one thing that Metroid has had quite a lot of in the past, it'll be problems. Chalk it up to age and how no franchise that is 35 years old this year can be literally flawless for that long, but that doesn't excuse some awful design decisions made over that time. It's not so bad though, because if I take some time to talk about all the negatives, we can spend the rest of the month talking about all the good stuff. And considering how amazing Metroid Dread is, there's a lot of that going around right now. I guess I'll just be super negative for 15 minutes then. Don't mind me, just peeing in your bonfire.
I suppose this video is a little less depressing now that the situation with Metroid is a little more stable and not spiraling hopelessly out of control because, you know, Nintendo have a plan now and they're executing it pretty well. It kind of reminds me of how Keeps have a plan to help men with their hair loss because 2 out of every 3 guys will experience some form of baldness before they turn 35. So maybe we need just one more nugget of positivity.
It's good to know that while Metroid might be bad and stupid sometimes, Keeps are still being consistently awesome with their FDA-approved treatment for hair loss. These guys are experts at returning hair to thinning scalps with a ton of successful cases under their belts, and they're knowledgeable enough to know that hair loss is different from one guy to the next, which is why their treatment comes in 3 different variants depending on what kind of hair loss you're experiencing. Plus, you can get everything shipped directly to your door, so you don't have to wait for the world to not be so scary before you can fix your hair. Keeps' treatment packages are already cheaper than their competitors, but with the deal they're running with me, you can save even more money. For a limited time offer, you can go to keeps.com/rabbid or click the link in the description below to receive 50% off your first order. Stop hair loss now before it's too late.
Okay then, let's talk about other M a lot, I guess. I've always loved how Metroid is titled. Unlike other Nintendo IPs that are named after a significant character or the main character for, you know, brand recognition and icon recognition, these games aren't called like Samus or Samus Returns. They're named after Metroids, the main hostile alien race in these games. You know, it gives more significance to Metroids outside of the games, but inside, it kind of gives them this otherworldly quality that you really need to take them seriously when you do find them.
There's some lore you can look into if you're interested about how they were engineered by the Chozo to pass around the X-Parasite, and how Metroid is their word for Ultimate Warrior, but honestly, all we need to take away from all of that is that Metroids are absolute fuckers to kill. They're top of the food chain, the ultimate predator in the Metroid world, and so killing one requires a lot of work and a fair amount of caution so that the Metroid doesn't just suck the life out of you instead. Every time you see a Metroid for the first time in any one of these games, it's treated like a big deal. If just because the game needs to establish a base level of threat for a Metroid before introducing a host of variants that can do far more annoying things. Metroid Prime decided that the world needed fission Metroids to grapple with, even though I've got more interesting things to do than deal with a Metroid that makes even more Metroids. That has to be illegal. I feel like that's illegal. It's a fun idea in theory, apparently, but one that trips over at the first practical application, since fission Metroids have the ability to split into 2 smaller Metroids whose colour corresponds to what beam weapon will damage it, so naturally you encounter them towards the end of Metroid Prime once you've gathered up all the colours for your crayon set, and also because at this point Metroid Prime can stop pulling punches and start landing a few knockout blows when it comes to difficulty. It's an enemy design that pushes the UI to its limits, since while changing weapon isn't too difficult under normal circumstances, you really do have to be on it whenever 2 different coloured Metroids come at you looking for a scrap. It can be a little overwhelming. The only saving grace is that fission Metroids can be ignored because they're just normal enemies and not boss fights, and if you don't fancy playing Simon Says, you can just lay a power bomb down and be done with it. But I can't ignore how Nintendo were expecting these enemies to be defeated and how insane this design is. Last time I checked, Metroids were scary enough on their own. Leave the science to the bad guys, okay? I played Metroid Dread in between making this video and the last one, and let me tell you, I'm one happy boy these days. I played it on the new Nintendo Switch OLED with both the game and the console provided by Nintendo, and let me tell you, Mercury Steam have such a great understanding of what makes Metroid great that I think they should be given the keys to the kingdom, and the freedom to make whatever type of Metroid game they want next, because this is now 2 games in a row that they've knocked out of the park. In which case, you're probably wondering why I'm being so positive in a video designed to do the opposite, and while I'm sure there's negatives in Dread somewhere, I actually want to discuss a major issue I have with Samus Returns. There aren't many, don't worry, but there's always a danger when remaking an older game that you introduce new elements that don't vibe well with what's already there, and while I know a lot of people weren't so keen on the melee counter, my gripe comes with the end of the game, where you've just destroyed the last Metroid but one on a planet full of them, and you're now escorting the baby Metroid to the surface and off the planet. But hold on, this moment needs a bit more Ridley! You know, a character who wasn't even in the original game. He was just late to the party is all.
I want to say that you can never have too much Ridley, because I don't think there's been a moment where he's turned up in a Metroid game and I haven't been excited for the boss fight, but Samus Returns is the exception to that, because he's bolted onto the end of the game as the final boss fight, kind of, but with no thought over what that would do to the tone and the feel of the ending of the game. But you know, you gotta fill those quotas somehow.
Metroid 2 is a very different kind of Metroid game. Every other game ends with some exciting escape sequence as the planet or space station self-destructs after a climactic final boss battle. It's high stakes right at the end so that when you do throw yourself over the line, it feels like one big sigh of relief that it's all over. Metroid 2 is completely different. You defeat the final Metroid and that's kind of it. You escort the baby Metroid off the planet with this almost serene quietness to it, and also, of course, unrushed and in your own time. Almost as though the gravity of the situation is only just sinking in. Have you really killed every Metroid? Should you be rescuing this last Metroid? But then, in the remake, Ridley shows up, kind of out of nowhere, and makes it all about him, at a time when that couldn't be further from the truth. Don't get me wrong, it's a pretty good boss fight, and Mercury Steam really know what they're doing with Metroid, but then again, maybe they don't? It's like Ocarina of Time. You defeat Ganon, you seal him in the Sacred Realm, Zelda sends you back to the child timeline to live your life, you watch some credits where everyone's getting lit on Lon Lon Milk, and then imagine if, after all of this, just as the game's winding down, BAM! It's the Thunderbird from Zelda 2! Back for more. Games should be allowed a quiet moment to reflect on their adventure, and I wish Mercury Steam had more confidence in Samus Returns' ability to be quiet. Let it breathe once in a while. Fuck the Spider Guardian, all my homies hate the Spider Guardian. It's actually been a really long time since I first talked about the Spider Guardian on this channel. It must have been close to like 10 years ago at this point, which is a frightening thing to admit, but a sign that the hatred still burns strong after all these years. My favourite boss fights in Metroid have always been those battles against giant monsters and machines, because it feels like the odds are stacked heavily against you and the payoff waiting for you at the end will be massive. Smaller boss fights aren't exactly doomed from the start, but the Spider Guardian commits the cardinal sin of kinda not even being a boss fight. Your opponent is this tiny bug who scoots around on the walls and who never attacks you directly. Oh fuck, where do I sign up? Hey, you know that morph ball thing that is quite fun sometimes, but is a little hard to control in 3D? Yeah, we're gonna make a boss fight where you're stuck as a ball the whole time and you need to solve this bullshit puzzle with gates and electric fences and a tiny insect that does a surprising amount of damage for its size. It might actually be the worst thing ever, which gets even worse if you play on hard mode and fancy watching your health bar collapse every time you get tickled by a pill bug. I can't even think about how far away this fight is from the nearest save station without my mouth filling up with sick, but would you believe me if this boss fight was so very nearly not so shitty? Yeah, Mike Wyken of Retro Studios admitted that the Spider and the Boost Guardian, who I don't really care for either, were made more difficult at the last minute because senior staff were concerned that these fights weren't challenging enough. Someone lent on the difficulty sliders and made both fights so disgustingly difficult that they were eventually nerfed into the ground for the Prime Trilogy. Well, it's good to know that the devs learned their lesson. Now give me back all the time I wasted dying to this fucker. I know you can do that. You can do anything. Did everyone enjoy that nice little warm-up? it was fun looking at good games that have a couple of blind spots that didn't quite have as much thought put into them as the rest of the game. Well, that's over now because it's time to talk about Metroid Other M. I want to say nice things about this game, but every time I start praising things like presentation and boss designs and music, I can feel my thoughts drowning out my own words as I'm reminded of everything else that Other M has wrong with it. It actually puts me in a tricky position because I want to narrow all the problems down to one moment, and that's quite hard in a game with issues that run for most of its duration. In the end, I landed at one of the most egregious examples of bad design and writing colliding, and fishing through the wreckage reveals just 2 words. Ability restriction. Nothing new for Metroid, of course. Most games do this to give you a chance to find new power-ups and gradually become stronger. But Other M is a little special because you have your abilities, you're just not allowed to use them. For all the sense that makes.
Metroid Other M loves a bit of heavy-handed symbolism, and as a way of demonstrating that Samus respects the leadership of Adam Malkovich, she decides to agree to restrict her abilities and only use what Adam says to use. It's an interesting take on the classic Metroid restricting of abilities, but it's also really bad, because Adam is a stingy bastard.
The Federation are up to all sorts of no good in this game, but as soon as they enlist Samus's help, it makes 0 sense for Adam to restrict Samus as harshly as he does in this game. I don't want to get into the military protocol of the situation because A, I don't know, and B, I read through a thread on TV Tropes and wanted to end it all after about 30 seconds, so instead I'm going to look at it from a few more important angles. Story-wise, it makes sense, since you need to establish that sort of dynamic between Samus and Adam, but there's other ways of doing so without completely robbing Samus of her independence and instead applying her experience from a series of very important missions to give Samus more of a concrete opinion on not burning to death. Seriously, it's a big problem that a more self-assured protagonist would provide some pushback against as a way of building conflict and mistrust, which would be perfectly in character for the stoic badass that Samus is in all her other games. In reality, Samus is a little too passive and a bit too yes sir, no sir to do anything but agree with Adam, which puts her at odds with a player who likely knows what they're doing, doesn't have that history with Adam, and just wants to do what they want. So this one decision from the devs and writers ruins the typical item dynamic, butchers Samus's relationship with Adam, and severs any relatability that Samus has with the player. Just think of all the problems you wouldn't have if this was done another way. Thank fuck that Metroid Dread brought badass Samus back. I have missed her greatly. With Metroid Dread doing so well at the moment, it's easy and preferable to forget about the franchise's darker days. Days that weren't all that long ago. Every franchise goes through a period of uncertainty where games aren't quite up to the usual standard and doubt starts to creep in. You know what kind of game is needed, but you don't have a lot of faith that the devs can actually deliver it. Other M was a fairly catastrophic low point that threatened to derail the entire series, but it took Nintendo until 2015 to put their cards on the table and show the world to what extent they didn't know what they were doing. I've always said that the period immediately preceding the Switch was full of awful Nintendo games, but Metroid Prime Federation Force didn't even have the excuse of being on the Wii U. It's a new Metroid game on the 3DS that is multiplayer only and almost entirely devoid of Samus at a time when the general public are pining for a new traditional Metroid game. It's not even close. The thing is that Federation Force in isolation is quite good. It's a fun arcade shooter that is able to distill the essence of first-person Metroid combat into an easily digestible format that welcomes in new players for some multiplayer Metroid action that doesn't happen very often. There's a lot of game to play and enjoy, both alone and with friends, and it ends up feeling like a decent entry into this franchise. So, what's the problem? Well, my problem is the timing. Announcing and releasing Federation Force when they did gave the game no realistic chance of doing well, and so many fans immediately disowned the game because it wasn't the Metroid game they were hoping for. It's not really the fans' fault, because you can't force them to be excited for a game that isn't what they want at that moment in time, and it's definitely not Federation Force's fault for being something different. It's Nintendo's fault for commissioning an experimental new type of Metroid game at a time when the general public was still feeling sore about Other M and the lack of a new game on the Wii U. We're still fucking waiting, come on now! It's such an obvious error, and I'll prove it. If Nintendo released Federation Force tomorrow as a lower-budget multiplayer Metroid game that was priced appropriately and as part of a major milestone for the franchise, much like it was in 2016, I guarantee you that people would feel better about it because you're not asking Federation Force to be the next step in the franchise. It's just another game. You'll be surprised how well people perform with the pressure off.
At the time, all the dialogue surrounding Federation Force was so viciously aggressive, as if Nintendo were asking this game to swim in a sea of piranhas. You know, with a new game concept, maybe start with the Goldfish Bowl first. This is RabbidLuigi, and if you've enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more in the future. And if you want to watch something right now, there's a video here about the best weapons in Metroid games. I also want to thank my top supporters on Patreon, including Christopher Robinson, AJ887, and the Green Scorpion. Thank you for watching, and when they're going to remake Metroid Prime Federation Force?